Welcome to this podcast from IS Services in Trinity College Dublin. My name is Conor Rappel, and in this podcast I will cover some tips for helping you plan the content of a PowerPoint presentation in an effective manner. This sort of planning is best done before you start using PowerPoint, as ultimately you'll save time creating the PowerPoint presentation, as opposed to letting the presentation grow organically by adding slide after slide and ending up with something that's not the right length or doesn't flow well. It can be helpful to brainstorm on paper before putting any tight structure on topics. This helps to avoid the temptation to add in new information as it occurs to you. The goal at this stage would be to simply come up with the topic or category names. Later, you can concentrate on the content within each topic. So when planning titles for each slide, you'll usually use your opening slides to introduce the concepts of your presentation. So the headings here will be something like Introduction, Agenda, Overview. Similarly, in the closing slides you want to sum up your presentation. The headings might be something like Summary, Conclusions, or Future Plans. And then the headings for remaining slides in the middle of the presentation would usually follow the names of the particular topics that you've identified. And with that in mind, you may have a time restriction with regards to your presentation. From that point of view, it's important at the outset to have some idea of approximately how many slides you're going to require. And once you have a better idea of this, you can then begin inserting the main content. A simple rule of thumb then is to allow 2 or 3 minutes per slide. However, this is heavily dependent on the type of material in the presentation, so you should increase or decrease this as appropriate, and you can firm up on the overall timing by running through a rehearsal of the slideshow. When planning the content that goes into each slide, there's a few important aspects to consider in order to reduce the cognitive load. One thing to look at is to introduce a mix of visual aids to help deliver your message, rather than concentrating on bulleted text alone. And for that reason, it's important to try to use images, drawing objects, charts and tables, where possible, to break the monotony of bulleted list after bulleted list. Provide the information in digestible chunks. Use keywords. Avoid long sentences, as people will read the text on screen when they should be listening to you. Also, long sentences lend to a cluttered appearance. Keep the language and terminology clear, consistent and simple as possible. Use logical transitions between topics. Discipline is needed in this case, as often you as a presenter will know more than might be appropriate to the audience, so you need to be careful to keep things relatively straightforward. You should use an animation scheme to introduce each item on any slide, one at a time. This helps focus the audience on the item you're speaking about, without the temptation for them to read ahead. When planning your content, it's important to know your audience. Primarily, be aware of what they need to know. Ensure that central message is delivered clearly. Then consider what other information they might like to know. And thirdly, consider what end result you're aiming for and what additional information you want the attendees to know. And these can be ranked in that order of importance. Your primary aim is to include the information that the audience needs to know. It also helps to build in opportunities for audience participation and outline practical situations. It's important to set realistic expectations. Try and have a strong introduction. Introduce yourself and your background and clearly state the objective. You could use a statistic, a quote or a joke, or lead with a clear summary in order to grab the audience's interest at the outset. Clarify the purpose of the presentation, and you should write any objective in the audience's point of view, keeping it measurable. If there's a conference theme or if you provided an abstract, then stick to the topic to avoid frustrating the attendees. In summary then, the main things to keep in mind when planning the content for your PowerPoint presentation would be first to brainstorm your topics on paper, to try and narrow down to the exact categories that you need to talk about. Sometimes this will depend on the amount of time that you have available to you. When it comes to entering content into PowerPoint, always try and reduce the cognitive load. Use keywords instead of sentences, and try and build in imagery instead of using bulleted text all the time. Lastly, especially when writing text, always keep the audience in mind. Again, the main aim is to deliver what they need to know, and avoid adding extra information if it's not appropriate to them. That concludes this podcast on planning the content in PowerPoint. Many thanks for your attention.